So hello and welcome to tonight's talk. This is the IDS Lecture Series, and we're delighted tonight to have two speakers. Actually, we were supposed to have three speakers, but one of them was ill, unfortunately. Tonight's topic is going to be global opportunities in education, so maybe all of us can find some great jobs working with global education or education globally. Education consultancies in developing countries, international teaching, and teaching English and global advocacy. And so I'll introduce the three speakers, even though one of them is sick. Our first speaker, Dori, has agreed to cover the material that the second speaker was going to cover. So this is Dr. Dori Nielson, and she's an educator with lots of teaching experience at the elementary school, junior high school, and also post-secondary levels. She's the Education Fiscal Analyst for Montana Legislature. She's been the Measurement and Accountability Administrator for the Montana Office of Public Instruction. And she's also an independent education consultant who does research and reporting for school administrators of Montana, Montana legislative committees, the Montana School Board, and other state groups. Most recently, she's been an international education consultant involved in USAID international projects in the Georgia, so not the state of Georgia, but the former Soviet Union Republic of Georgia, Liberia, Zambia, and Ghana, and she retired from a lot of this work in 2014. Unfortunately, Nancy Marmont couldn't be with us tonight, but she's also a very experienced educator. She has a lot of experience in U.S. foreign language teaching at various levels, and she's been a foreign teacher in France and Russia. She's been an international baccalaureate instructor, a curriculum developer, and she's received various national awards, including the Fulbright Rockefeller Fellow, National Endowment for the Humanities, and Independent Study for the Humanities, and United World College IB training. She's taught or studied in Japan, France, Quebec, Canada, Morocco, Tunisia, Paris, Dubai, and Martinique. And she retired in 2005. And finally, today we'll have Dr. Carla Mettling. She's an English professor, and she retired after 29 years of teaching American and British literature, the humanities, and writing at an assortment of private and community colleges and universities in Chicago and also in Florida, also in Beirut, Lebanon, Evansville, Indiana, and most recently Columbia, Missouri. She semi-retired in 2012, and she's still the co-leader of Results, a global anti-poverty citizens lobbying group, and she also teaches at the University of Montana's Mali program and also as an adjunct instructor. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dori, and she noted that you may certainly raise your hand and ask a question if you have one as she goes. So Dori.
Thank you. I did attend one of your other sessions that you had a while back, so I had some sense of what was happening here. And do feel free just to interrupt, ask questions at any point.
You might have to do page down. There you go.
Okay, get back to this. I've worked in international consultancies, and that's really what I'm going to cover. I'm not going to go back over all that other stuff. But consultancy companies manage projects that are proposed by funding agency groups. There are a lot of funding agencies that will put out RFPs, requests for proposals, and they will say they want an education program that will test students in grades whatever, in English and whatever, and they need this kind of expertise. And if you have contacted some of these companies, and there's a list that on the back of the sheet that you have that lists all kinds of companies. I did not give you the websites, but if you look them up, you'll find their websites. And they will ask you to fill out their forms and provide a resume. And what they do is, and they want you to have experience, by the way, but what they do is they keep that resume, and when they're searching for somebody that, for instance, somehow I stumbled into education finance, and if they search for education finance and your resume comes up, they might contact you and just say, are you interested in this project? Are you available? Here's what we require of you. And so there are many consultancy groups, and it isn't just education, it's all over the boards. So USAID is a major funding source here in the US, but there are Australian companies, there are French companies, there are German companies. They prefer non-Americans, but there are times when the expertise of an American suits them very well. But if you're interested and you want to search out some of those, just to look them up, and they ask you to sign up, there are free ones and then there are ones that you have to pay a membership for. Now, what defines a developing country? Well, it depends on the agency that's funding. There are other terms that emerging, transitioning, third world. Developing sounds better. There is no real definition. A few years ago, there was a pretty solid definition from companies, but it all had to do with westernizing the countries. You know, let's make them industrial, let's change them to be like us, without recognizing the value of their agriculture, without really recognizing their cultural bases. But that is changing, and that has changed. The UN has always been broader than that. But the perspectives include, if it's one of the monetary funds or the World Bank, they worry about diversification of experts, industrial development, integration with financial systems, that type of thing. If you're talking about a World Trade Organization, they're concerned about a smooth trade flow, particularly with them. And so whichever member is providing some financial support, like building a railroad, but it might be to build a railroad to bring ore from a mine to the coast so it can be shipped away, but they have some kind of personal benefit involved, but they also leave a benefit behind for the country. The UN has a much broader humanitarian base, per capita income, literacy rate, percent in school, that type of thing. USAID functions mostly, it's part of our State Department, economic development, humanitarian assistance. However, you'll notice that second line. It's in support of the foreign policy of the US. So we often aren't in countries where the foreign policy doesn't suit our needs. So it has a tinge of our interests involved in it. But it's still providing humanitarian services and economic development. And then other considerations for almost all of them have to do with natural disasters, conflicts, recovering from conflicts, effectiveness of the courts, human rights violations, rights of women, that sort of thing. So the perspective of the group that you're looking at is going to be different from one group to another. Of what do they consider a developing country? The USAID projects I worked in, I was in Georgia first with one company that no longer exists because they got themselves in trouble with some of their finances. And interesting thing is USAID made them shut down their operations. So all the people, all the projects just moved over to another company. So, you know, they shut them down, but not really. Liberia, Zambia, and Ghana were all another company, DevTech. Georgia was AED, which doesn't exist. And then I was back in Georgia with Humanities. And that was a really interesting consultancy. And then the sixth one, I was back in Georgia just for a very short time to help a company try to get a project, try to design one. That was also interesting. All right, so I'm talking about Georgia, and do we have a... I've got Georgia on another map too, so it's okay if we don't have it. Yeah, but yeah, Georgia. Do you guys have an idea of where Georgia, Ghana, Liberia, Zambia are?
So here's Georgia somewhere over here, right?
Yeah, can I do it on here? Oh, I can do it here. Not a problem. Okay. Yeah, you can probably guess where Zambia and Ghana and Liberia are. That's probably pretty easy.
Zambia was easy because we just had someone speak on Zambia, so that's easy.
That's, all right, so I'm going to, right here, this little thing right here is Liberia. It used to be known as the Pepper Coast because nobody really lived there. The malaria was so bad, but it grew hot peppers. And it was not very likely to be populated, except upcountry. And then next to it was the Gold Coast, and next to it was Ghana, or the Ivory Coast, I'm sorry. And next to it is, this is the Ivory Coast, this was the Pepper Coast, and this is the Gold Coast, but the Gold Coast is now Ghana. And Georgia, well, Liberia too. Liberia is 1/3 the size of Montana. Georgia is 1/3 the size of Montana, with a lot more people. I'm showing you this map of Georgia. You can see Georgia over there. Look how small it is. Why do you suppose it's really important to Europe and to the United States? Just think for a minute. See its location. North of it is Russia. South of it is Turkey and all the Mideastern Arabian countries. Caspian Sea is filled with oil. The only way the oil can come out of there is through Russia, through Iran, through Turkey, or through Georgia. And there's a major pipeline through the middle of Georgia. Georgia was part of the Silk Route, and everybody's been there. The Hittites, the Romans, the Greeks, the Mongols, everybody's been through the middle of that country because it's a pathway. And somehow the Georgians maintained their language, their culture, their religion. They claim the honor of being the second Christianized country in the world way back in, I don't know, 400 or 300, something like that. But they never tell you who the first is, and I didn't learn that until I went to Armenia. They claim they're the first, but the Georgians aren't going to tell you. Anyway, it's a very strategic place, and one of the reasons it was able to maintain its identity is because of the Caucasus Mountains. The Greater Caucasus are the division between Georgia and Russia, and there's really only one passageway through those mountains, and that keeps them somewhat protected. This, tall mountain that you see right here, this is Mount Elbrus. This is all Georgia, that's Russia. And it's close to the Black Sea, so the mountain goes immediately up from the Black Sea, from sea level to 18,500 feet. The Greater Caucasus are really high. And this is another scene, and you often saw things like this when you're there. But way back here, I thought those were clouds, but that's the mountains too. There's no place in the country where you don't see mountains. This is the Lesser Caucasus, and this is Turkey, right over here. And if you see this gondola, I had the opportunity to live there for 2.5 years, and so I traveled around western Georgia, all over western Georgia. I got to so many wonderful places. But this village, they dared me to take the gondola to the other side. If you drove to the other side, to the village on the other side, it took 4.5 hours. If you took the gondola, it took 20 minutes. And there's no way I was going to do it because the maintenance was not part of the Soviet Union's budgets, never. Everything is just falling apart. So I looked at it where the windows is broken out. You know, I'm sure that it hasn't been inspected in a long time, but the village fathers were going to go. So I said, okay, I'll go. It got to the middle where it dipped way down, and they stopped. And they thought they did it on purpose to panic me. And I figured, well, the village fathers are here, so I'm not worried. But they were, because he couldn't get it started again, because it was at its lowest point. And I looked out the window, which was broken out, and I thought, helicopter's the only thing that's going to get us out of here. And so we ended up rocking it so that we could get momentum, so it could go back to the other side. And as soon as we got to the other side, they broke open bottles of champagne. You know, the people were wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But, you know, you have to be part of what they do in order to make sure that they're comfortable with you. And that was one of my trips. But I didn't ride the elevators in their buildings if I could avoid it. Because you get into the elevator, often the lights didn't work in it, the buttons were broken, the walls were kind of peeling and falling off. And I keep saying, oh, where's the Otis inspection chart? And I'm sure that Anyway, I walked. I did a lot of walking. Okay, so the reason we were there was this was right after the first election that brought into place Western-style democracy with Saakashvili. And they were decentralizing because everything was controlled from the central location. Money went out to the regions, but only to somebody's cousin, uncle, brother, whatever. It didn't make it to the schools, it didn't make it to roads, it didn't make it to buildings, unless you had someone that was willing to distribute it. Teachers made their money by parents paying them to pass their students. And part of what happened is when I was there, and they're now doing trainings, there were doctors that had probably never taken a course because they got their way paid by their parents paying the instructors. Or maybe they took a few courses, but it was scary. And so you needed to know someone who knew someone who knew that someone was really a trained doctor. And the Israelis and the Swiss were there with programs that interned people that were already considered doctors to prove that they were doctors. And if they could prove in an internship that they were a doctor, they had this big thing on the wall that said certified by the government of Switzerland or certified by Israel. And dentists, all of that same, you had to be somewhat careful. So Georgia was trying to do everything all at once. All of those things all at the same time. No experience, no plan, no resources. So there were all kinds of people there, all kinds of consultancies from all kinds of countries when I was there. They had fired the whole police force and started over. Because the same with them, they didn't pay the police force. So how do you get money? You extort it from businesses. And so the whole culture change was a shakeup. The project I was on was to renovate and support new education resource center structure. Now there were some kind of education offices throughout the country, but this was a 3-year project. My task was, I was a supervisor for Western Georgia to provide skills support for the ERC staff, because the staff now had to account for money. They had never accounted for money before. They didn't have money. Why would you be accounting for money you don't have? Plus, there was not a single accounting course taught in the whole country. And they're suddenly supposed to provide financial reports to the government. This is what the buildings looked like that we were supposed to renovate. And people were actually working in these buildings. And one of this is the floor, this is the ceiling. This is the ceiling. Things had broken through the ceiling. I mean, they looked like this. This is what they looked like. And they were supposed to work there. They didn't have heat. A lot of them had paper over the windows because the windows were broken out. We renovated quite a few of them, and this is what they looked like when we got done. Unfortunately, the workmanship is very poor, and so I'm not sure how long some of it will last. In a couple of them, they were renovated to the point where we found that a couple of the resource center directors were living in them because they were so much nicer than their homes. And they had bathrooms, because most of the places didn't have bathrooms. You had to go find an outdoor toilet someplace. But in one of them, I went back to it sometime later and discovered that they had not hooked up the toilets or the sinks yet. Well, the sinks, yes, but the toilets, no. But people were using them. And I said, how come they're not hooked up yet? Because the city was supposed to do that. And they said, oh, as soon as we get the trench dug to the river, we'll hook it up. And that river flowed into the Black Sea. I didn't swim in the Black Sea. I brought together a finance task force from the centers because they were supposed to train the schools. Every school was supposed to have an accountant, but no accountants had ever been trained in the country, including these folks. Most of them had economics degrees. So after having met with people for a while, I discovered some that were really pretty sharp and pretty bright. So I pulled together a task force, and my staff said, we can't use that word task force because we don't know what it is. We don't know what it is. And I said, they said task is some work. And I said, yeah, call it a task force. Well, they weren't used to coming together to do some work. They were used to coming together to be told what to do. So it took a long time before they even would speak up. So I had to have them get into groups and edit some of the things that I was going to publish for them, which were little manuals of finance advice. How do you actually keep books? How do you keep track of money? And they were supposed to read sections. That was their task. Read sections, tell us what's wrong with it, what doesn't make sense. They wouldn't tell me, so I broke them up with my staff, and then they started to do it. And in one instance, their statement was, I don't think it was necessary to say that you'll call the police. And I said, I didn't say anything about calling the police. And one of my staff said, oh, yes, you did. Remember you said that the principals should move around the school so they know what their staff is doing and not just sit in their office, which was traditional, because they didn't want things to go wrong and then be caught off guard. And that got translated as, or the police will come and get you. So anyway, by the time I got done training these people, 8 of them had gotten jobs somewhere else because now they knew how to account for money. And so anyway, but the government of Georgia printed these manuals for me. There are 2 of them, and distributed them to all the schools, which at least they had something in their hands if they wanted to learn, because they were supposed to provide financial reports every year. This is what the Georgian alphabet looks like. It's used only in Georgia. Imagine taking notes using this. You know, here's the first letter of my name. Here's the second letter of my name. Here's the third letter of my name. This letter I could remember. All the E sounds are this one. But imagine if you had to do that. So you might want to glance at one of these manuals when... Sure. There are 2 of them. They're different, but you won't know the difference anyway. You can send this one back. If I wrote a paragraph this long, when it got translated, it was this long.
Was there a way to recheck, so that you could have had it translated back into English so you could catch all the errors?
What I would do was I had staff of 3 women. One did not speak English, but she was very talented as far as finding people and working with people. And I was able, what I did was have them read back to me. They'd read a page to me that they had just translated, and that's how we do it. So it was kind of a hard process, but they had to read it to me. They had to read it to me in English, and if it sounded right in English, then it was okay. But we did have to make corrections, yes, because the translations sometimes were way over there, like calling in the police. But anyway, this is, if you want to go to Georgia and learn Georgian, good for you. There was a Peace Corps young man that I met who within about 6 months had learned at least to speak Georgian. And I could go into the grocery stores, and they were small places where you pointed at things in the shelves. And I needed salt and I needed sugar, but they looked the same. So I had to learn the words for salt and sugar, and salt was marili, and sugar was sukri. I mean, that was pretty easy. But and I went into this little store where the women did the work, but a guy owned it. And one of the times I walked in, he said, oh, me, English. And so I said, sukri. And he turns to the group, and he said, she wants sugar. And I mean, they didn't know English, but, and when I said marili, he turned to him and said, she wants marili. I mean, and all they could do was laugh. I mean, he was the big guy. He was important. They did the work. The project impact, by the time we left, 54 education resource centers have been refurbished. There were still a few more to go, but time ran out. 2 finance manuals have been printed, and the resource center directors have been involved in many training sessions. It was a wonderful experience. I have friends there. When I left there, I had, in Batumi, where I lived, right in the Black Sea, I had lived right on the edge of the Black Sea, there were no native English speakers in the community. It was about the size of Missoula. And so I got to know some English teachers. And one of them became my good friend. In fact, I want to go back to visit her. But she was teaching English. She was an Abkhazian refugee, and that's a history piece. But she had to earn her way by tutoring, and she had to do it in her little apartment. And there were some others that were teaching English, which was very important to them. They really needed English. And they realized that if they could rent a place where 5 of them could take turns, where they could have a group meet to learn English, it was much wiser than just doing one in their apartment, where a couple of them had some young twins. I mean, it was very complicated. But they couldn't get a loan. 1, because they were women, and 2, because they needed to prove that they had a contract for a job in order to get a loan. Well, they didn't have a contract because they were English teaching, private lessons. And I was told that if they got a loan from the bank, there would be 40% interest anyway. So I loaned them some money, but I didn't expect to get the money back. I just thought they deserved the venture. They deserved to try it. And so I loaned them $5,000 and told them not to worry about paying it back. We'd talk about it, in a year after I was back in the US. And 6 months later, I got a check for $2,500 from them. And 6 months after that, I got the other $2,500. The last I heard, they have 176 students, and they bought an apartment for their offices. It's huge. It's huge. So sometimes you leave behind something that you didn't expect to do. And that kind of happened everywhere. Second project I went on was to provide technical support to the Ministry of Education. And this was Chemonics. Chemonics is a really good organization, by the way. I'm very impressed with Chemonics. And it's on the list. If you have any interest, I would definitely check Chemonics. My task was financial education advisor. Because of some of the things I fell into over the years, in my list of things I've done, somehow I was a fiscal analyst for the legislature for education. In fact, for the funding formula for the university and for the Votechno centers.
Oh, you're the problem.
I know, I was part of the problem. And when I took the job in Helena, the woman that was leaving showed me the formula. It was on sheets of paper on 3 walls. And so when I was asked to revise and I worked with the funding formula for our schools too, the general education schools. When I had to revise this funding formula for general education schools, I was called in by Chemonics because USAID had said I'd done those financial manuals. And they had brought in a man from Poland who had done their first formula, and he was arrogant. It's I know the right way, and you're supposed to do it my way. And it was the way they did it in Poland. And they thanked him, and when he left, they went to the head of Chemonics and said, okay, get us somebody that will do this for us. And so they called me because USAID said call her. And it was a great opportunity too. But the complication with doing this was that it was extremely complex. They have 2,600 schools. They finance each of them separately. There weren't any districts. So even if it was a school of 7, they all had to have accountants, even a school of 7. And they had to have a principal. And it included 250 private schools that were fully funded, just like the general education schools. And they were Orthodox schools, because that's the religion of the country, but supposedly it's not officially the religion of the country. Okay, so they have so many government requirements, including in this formula, enrollment by classroom in every school, based on the actual reported number of students in the classroom. The salaries for each individual teacher. They have no multi-grade classrooms, even if they have 7 students in the school. So if any of you have worked in Excel, I can't tell you how many thousand cells were filled with the data that had to be in this formula. And it ended up that they did accept the one I put together, but it's only if it's their formula or their work, or if they've adopted it themselves with some sense of input, that it really works, which is the problem with the guy from Poland. He just said, here, I know what I'm doing, do this. And I was working with some young people in the ministry who were really sharp. And when I got done with this huge formula, because I started out with a list of schools and a couple of things they'd done. When I got done with it and I was about to take it over to the ministry, I looked at it and I realized if you take a look, it tells you who built the original file. It was a guy I was working with in the ministry. So when I took it to him, I said, look, this is your file. I just made it a little better. So it became their formula. And the Ministry of Education bought into it, they used it, and they brought me back a year later to upgrade it because we knew it wasn't perfect because we didn't have good data. Within a year, we had much better data. So that was a wonderful project. Both of those. And Georgia's a beautiful place if you ever have a chance to go to Georgia. I have thousands of pictures, and I pulled them out. I had some in here, and I thought, no, this isn't a travelogue. The third project was one of the things that happens. This is an example of this company, and I can't even remember which one it was because I don't want to remember it. It was RFI or it was BHI, and I don't even know what that stands for. But they asked me if I would come with one of their staff to Georgia to interview because they wanted to write a response to a USAID RFP. And the RFP is a request for proposal. They'll say, we want to fund a project that will train teachers to work with English, math, whatever, and then test them at the end of 3 years, or will, just whatever. But they put out this simple proposal, and then people have to respond with all the details of how they're going to do it and who might be on the project. Because if they'll get more points if someone who's going to be on the project has been in the country before, or speaks the language, or has a lot of background in the area. That doesn't mean they'll actually hire you, but they'll put your name on it so they get extra points, and then maybe they'll hire you. But so I went with them to Georgia, and they had no cultural background in Georgia. They had never done an education project there before. They had never done any project there before. And they didn't have any idea what the educational structure was. And even though we met with some folks who were, gave them suggestions, some really good educators over there, they kept putting together some kind of a proposal that was really throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They were going to just kind of wipe out everything that had been done in the last 5 years after, 5 or 6 years after they left the Soviet Union and start over again. They didn't get the award. Plus, they'd only give me paragraphs to look at and ask me to edit them, but they wouldn't let me see the whole proposal because it was proprietary, and they were afraid I'd steal it. Well, there's no way I was going to take it, and they didn't get it. In fact, I don't know who got it, but they shouldn't have gotten it. It was, that's part of the problem with 3-year projects. Then they write another 3-year project, and some of them don't have any relationship to the former one or any relationship to a couple others that are in the country. The coordination isn't good. There are a lot of things going on from different companies, and they're competitive. And so they really don't want each other to know what's going on. I hope there's more cooperation now than there was before, but some of it was pretty bad. Okay, after my first Georgia project, in between that and the other Georgia projects, I was in Africa. And on this map, you can see, here's Liberia, here's Ghana. The equator's right about here. So the sun came up at 6 in the morning and the sun went down at 6 at night, or within a few minutes of it, every single day. So when I got off work, it was already dark. And there wasn't much tourism that I did in the country of Liberia, except work. I went to work, I came home from work, and stayed in a hotel. But I did get to go up country because we were testing kids. And while I have this map up, Zambia's right here. You can see Zambia is quite a bit bigger. And right down here, between Zambia, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana is Victoria Falls, which is, you'll see a few pictures of that. Liberia was founded by freed American slaves, first settled in 1822. A lot of them died of malaria. It was a very infested area. The Americo-Liberians, the group that came over from the US, and they were sent with 2 different motives. one was a group that truly believed that they needed to get them out of the US because they were going to be captured and taken back into slavery. Washington was one of the people that freed all his slaves when he died. That was in his will. So there were quite a few freed American slaves, but as soon as a slave owner could capture one, they were back into slavery. So there were those, there were ones that had escaped, and then they really wanted them someplace safe, and then there were the others that really didn't want blacks competing for their lives. And so there were two groups that were moving them over to Liberia. But what they did, unfortunately, was they took the culture with them that they knew, and they set up their own plantation system when they got to Liberia and got some of the local tribes to become essentially their slaves, and even built things that looked like plantation houses. A lot of them would just have fronts that looked like a plantation. And so 5%, up until that civil war that lasted off and on for 20 years, which was not very long ago, started in 1990, 5% controlled the rest of the people in the country. They just sent a little bit of money to the head of the tribes, and that was all they did. I mean, there was no education, there was no integration, there was no concern about what was happening with them. And look at this. This is when I went there, the life expectancy was 42 and the per capita income was $239. And then after I was there, because things were starting to come back, but the infrastructure was completely destroyed. There was no electrical grid in the country. The roads were unbelievably bad. The capital city had no sewer system, had no water system, had no electrical system. There were some generators. Everything looked like a war zone. The buildings had bullet holes, were half broken down. One of the fellows that I worked with in the ministry had an office with a computer and no electricity, not a piece of paper in his office. They were going through the motions, but they didn't have anything. There wasn't a bookstore in the country. And after I left, then they were starting to, come back from nothing. But after I left, Ebola hit. And so they've really been decimated. The project that I was there for was the Liberian ELP project. I became an evaluator in the 3 African countries. And in this one, I was to evaluate the effectiveness of the accelerated learning program. ALP condensed 6 years of elementary education into 3 years for those who received no schooling during the civil wars that went on. And there were a lot of them because it was dangerous. Child soldiers, they were stealing 12-year-old kids, and it was hideous. And people wouldn't talk to me about it. They said it was too awful. It was too awful. And DevTech, you see the name DevTech up there, they're also a good company. They do mostly evaluations of projects. And so I worked with them on 3 different projects in Africa. And this one I got into by accident because somebody called me and said she was going on a project to Liberia, and she was going the next week, and one of the 3 people on the project had just backed out. And they needed someone to go. And I had the right skills. And could I go? And I said, well, I can't go in a week. And so anyway, I went in 2 weeks, and I didn't know until I was crossing the ocean what my task really was when I was reading it. But we were going to test students in regular schools and in ALP to see how they were doing. Were they actually accomplishing something? The complication was I supposedly had a week to write a test that was valid and reliable. Well, that's not possible. So fortunately, they'd made a mistake, and I got 5 weeks. But I prepared a diagnostic exam, and they'd never heard of what a diagnostic exam would be. And that was merely, I'm not going to grade you. I'm not going to score you. I'm going to find out if you know what the curriculum says you're supposed to know at this point in your education. And fascinating information. We went to 39 classrooms up country. 806 students were tested. This is the team. We have, this is me in the middle, as you might guess. And this is Bonnie. She's the one that got me into it. And this is Jeff, and he's an Australian. He worked with the adults and the community people. She worked with teachers, and I tested kids. And they told me the Liberians would never understand my English, because theirs is sort of leftover from the southern accent they came with. And then without having books, it's sort of degenerated. These two young men helped me do the testing. They're the ones that could speak English I understood and Liberian English, which is something else. He's from the ministry. He came along because he really didn't trust us. By the end of the trip, he was calling me the Iron Lady. He's a good man, and he really got into it. And then these two are my drivers. This is the only one that talked to me about what it was like during the Civil Wars, because he was captured to be a child soldier at age 12. He was able to escape and ran. He said he went behind a bush to go to the bathroom. And he ran for the rest of the day and made it out of the country because he knew it was near a river. But here are the kinds of things we encountered. These are the roads. And we would wait until they went through with like a motorcycle or something to figure out whether you could actually go through it or not. And sometimes you couldn't. And this is actually Jeff. He's going up to help push. Because the native people that live in the area just look at us and think, you stupid people, you know you can't drive through that. So they just stand and watch. And then when about 15 cars line up, people get out and they push. And what they did was get this car out of the way, do a little shoveling, and then we went around. Because that truck needed a lot more than we could do. Then we got to this place, and I was kind of thirsty. And I said, well, what kind of drinks are those? And they laughed at me, and they said, that's a gas station. Yeah, got regular and ethyl, you know. And of course, laundry day, and unfortunately, probably drinking water day too. And if you look at these, you can, this is a school. There's schools, because it's so hot and it rains so much, these are open so that there's ventilation. But these are metal roofs, you can imagine what it's like inside when it rains. But see these things, these little dots on the pole, and this is right next to the school. Those are bullet holes. And when I was there, you're still finding empty shells. But look at the kids. Aren't they beautiful? What really bothered me is look at their teeth. They're beautiful. When you don't have a lot of candy and sugar and prepared foods. And the girls are not allowed to have afros when they go to school. And there's a lot of reason for it. It's not just the way they look, but it's because vermin gets into all that hair. And so they have to have their hair like this. Now, this is Bonnie. Can you imagine what's going on here?
Are they looking
This,
for a bruise or her white skin?
well, she does have a bruise, but we're up country. Some of these kids have never seen a white person before. And she's much fairer than I am. You can see my skin's a lot darker. They were scraping it because they thought she had powder or something on her skin. And I heard the story of a Peace Corps person that had stopped in a village, and you go through these little villages, and they're little, and there was a little boy running around with no clothes. And some of them don't speak English in those villages, but some do, because this was founded by people, supposedly, who speak English. And so I stopped, and he gave him a T-shirt, because he had nothing on, and the little boy put it on and was very happy. Well, sometime later, he came through, and he saw the same little guy running around in this T-shirt, and he went up to him, and he gave him another T-shirt. And the kid looked at it, and he handed it back. And he said, you don't like it? And he said, I already have one. They live differently than we do. Here are a couple of the classrooms. This is Edwinio doing the testing. It was Edwinio and Abba that tested for me. They did a great job. They got so excited that they wanted to score, then they wanted to enter the data, and then they wanted to help me with the analysis. And so they learned formulas, and both of them have had jobs since I left, because they had a skill that a lot of people didn't. So there are nice things you leave behind. This group is, look at those white shirts, and they come out of the huts, and their shirts are white. They have to have uniforms, they're supposed to wear shoes. The government does not provide any materials, any books. About the only thing teachers have is a blackboard and chalk. They do have that. We Americans are so nice, and so are the Brits. We send textbooks. Well, back in the jungles, one of the friends I made over there had been there for 34 years as a missionary, and she wanted her kids to go to school with the locals. And the locals had, she went and listened to the teacher, and he had an American book, and there are things in there like buying groceries in the grocery store. And there was the word skyscraper. And so he had this vocabulary list, and he explained to the kids that the skyscraper was what you use to clean the bottom of dirty clouds. So she decided that after school she would homeschool her kids, but she wanted them to go to school with the others. So pretty soon the whole village came after school to her house. But they're out there singing their national anthem. Now remember, 5% are controlling the 95% that's up country. Their national anthem says, "We came to these shores for freedom."
Are these the 95%?
These are part of the 95%. These are the upcountry. And there's been a move to try to change the national anthem, but that'd be like us changing our national anthem. Some of the teachers did a really good job with just about nothing. Notice the art over here. He's actually using words. His printing is very good. He's incorporating, a lot of things into what he's doing. But I want you to see the other side. That's what's really interesting. These are our 5 senses. Heading, what do you suppose that is?
Hearing.
Hearing. But that's how he hears it, and so that's how he writes it. And smelling, and seeing, and feeling, and testing. What's testing?
Tasting.
Tasting. But that's how they hear it, and so he says testing. And I saw him write the word slippas. They're shoes they call slippers. But slippas, S-L-I-P-P-A-S, slippas, because that's how they say it, which is why they wouldn't understand my English. You also saw this on the walls of most of the classrooms. See what it says? No sex for grades. The 2 young men I worked with were college graduates, and they said that they didn't know, now appreciate this, girls, they didn't know of a single female they went to school with that didn't have to trade that to get a grade. The exploitation's huge, and that's why these signs are all over now. In fact, there are even phone numbers out that say, if you apply for a job and it requires sex, call us. We'll take care of it for you. This was one of the ALP classes, and these are the older people that are trying to get their 3 years. Took this at night. I've got to get done. Took this at a class at night, testing at night. The generator went out. And they didn't miss a beat. They pulled out their flashlights, they pulled out their phones, and they just kept on they just finished it. We gave them our phones if they didn't have one. They didn't slow down. And this is Abba, by the way. This is the other one. These girls came with their parents at night, partly because they walked through the jungle and it was dark. Obviously, it gets dark at 6. And we had tested a couple of them during the day in the regular school. And the girl on the right holding that child, I said, "Is that your child?" And she said, no, it's my sister. But she said, "Will you take me with you?" I would love to have, but I couldn't. She knew what was in store. This young man, very bright, was getting his, he was getting his education too. I think he'd been a child soldier. And he as soon as he got done with our exam, he went to work on something else. But he got a problem right that was like 50 times 11 or something like that. It was a multiplication problem. It shouldn't be hard, right? The young man that were doing the testing with me did the gathering of note paper. I gave them blanks that they could do some work on. And they brought them up to me and said, "Look at this.
Oh my God.
This is their math process. Look at it. Even as simple as 2 + 3 + 7. They're using hash marks to figure out how to add things up. And for some reason, I don't understand this 10 process. At least somebody has tried to teach them to use 10s. But I don't know what they're doing. And we got 304 times 12, and we got as far as an 8. And we got 12, 12, 12, 12, and we got a 56. And most of them got their math wrong. But when I took this back to people who had helped me when I put the exam together, or the diagnostic test, they kind of said, well, this is how we teach them to do math, use hash marks. And it dawned on me, think of those villages where there's no paper, no pencils, and they have to have markets all the time to trade their goods. Okay, so you're going to sell 5 items that each cost 2 something. So you make hash marks in the dirt, and then you count them. And I said, but you're not going to get your own engineers, you're not going to get your own medical people, you're not going to get your own scientists if this is the only math that those people learn. And they were stunned because these were city people and they knew how to do it. But it never occurred to them that this was happening everywhere. And they can't do some of those problems. They just can't. They got a few right. And this is another piece. This was for the younger kids. We read them the problems. Draw a triangle. Well, draw a square. Must be a word that's sort of like some insect. In this one, draw a square. Look at, what did he do? We marked it wrong, and then when I looked at it, what is this?
It's a T-square.
It is a carpenter's square. And my dad was a carpenter, and when I looked at it, I thought, good grief. So they said, okay, were you in Zwedru when you did this one? I said, yeah. And they said, there's a roundabout with 3 streets that come in, and they call it a triangle.
So they do.
You know, so we got these bright people out there that really don't have educations. That's the value that you can be when you teach in some of those places. Okay, I'll get through this quickly. I have to. The ministry did not continue the accelerated program for 2 reasons. One, it would cost them money. Plus, they hoped that the US would ante up and do another one. I mean, that's part of their hope, because they're poor. And I don't know if they did or not. I don't know if the US did or not. And the other thing is parents wanted their kids in the 3-year program because it was quicker than the 6-year, and therefore they could be home working. But they did determine that basic skills were needed desperately. They did that. This is just,
skip that and just
yeah, I'm just skimming through it.
Yeah.
Then I was in Zambia, and we just evaluated the effectiveness of common components of 3 projects. And I had to review for a lot of things. I'm just going to show you. These are what the urban classrooms look like. The rural urban, these 2 were sewing. They got a grant to do a sewing machine so they could sew uniforms for kids, and then they could also make a little bit of money. This is the edge of an urban center. Look at how many kids are in a classroom. That teacher that's there taught 7 and T. This woman taught a 7 and a T. All she did was had them write a T, had them write a 7. She never told them what it was related to. AIDS orphans, several schools. I think this was sponsored by Rotary, by the way. And there was a radio program that gave her direction. At a certain time of day, these kids listened to it. It was a really good program. There was a health one that they also brought by radio, solar radio, to villages. Had a meeting with a village. You can see all the men are in the middle, all the women were on the left, and all the elders were on the right, and women didn't say a word when the men were in the room. Quickly, Victoria Falls, fantastic. The wildlife that was there, unbelievable. The baobab trees, the villages. People waited for 4 hours. We were 4 hours late here. This is a school. I watched him teach with a radio program, a math program. He did the best job I've seen even here, teaching it. And if you can see that is a flattened hood of a car. That's his blackboard. When we left, that's his blackboard. But they didn't have a roof, and I said, it's going to rain. And they covered it. He said he had a cover for it that he would take up there. And he said, don't worry about it being damaged or stolen, because it belongs to all of them. So the radio programs were canceled by the ministry, again, hoping that someone else would pick it up because it's expensive. They didn't continue that. I don't know what became of some of the other things. Ghana, I'm not going to tell you about Ghana. There was too much going on there. There were 2,000 kids tested in English and in their native language, and there were 10 languages. But these are the kind of images from there.
Can I ask you a question
Oh,
about
please.
Ghana? Can you move your microphone closer by walking?
Oh, yes, so that we can hear your question.
Yes, so, you know, this is so interesting, but you have a wealth of experience working at the state level in education. Could anybody like us coming, you know, just as professors or as recent graduates, could we find jobs as consultants, or is it really much higher level?
That's what you're going to see when we get to Nancy's really quickly. Let me get to that. That's a good question. In her international teaching, student exchanges, she lists the things that you can be doing. Volunteering, that's one of the things. If you can get some international experience, there's a lot you can do. Hers is, she taught in Moscow in an IB program, International Baccalaureate program. And she got to take the students everywhere. The Department of Defense, there are a lot of jobs available there.
You'd probably need a teaching certificate.
Yes, yes, teaching credentials, and then you have to have competency tests. And they're in a lot of places. International schools, 800 plus US style international schools, and a lot of educators, certification and experience. You're going to hear about some opportunities that don't require some of that. And these are wealthy. You're going to deal with wealthy ones. She said the salaries change greatly. This is Nancy's, who is ill. Hiring at jobs fairs, she said they're like speed dating for teachers. This was the school she taught in Moscow. Look at that. And it had to have cultural awareness. They went to military parades. They went a lot of places out of Russia to give them experiences. These are fishermen. This is, I can't remember where it is, but they got to Italy, they got to Morocco, they got all kinds of places. Her professional development took her to Mozambique and to China. She got everywhere. She had a Fulbright, a Rockefeller, Humanities, National Endowment for the Humanities, Japan. She was an experienced French teacher right here in Missoula. And it's now time.
Maybe there's questions, Dori, that you want to field before I start.
And while she's doing that, you can change the microphone out. So.
Yep.
Okay, so what I did is something that you would be qualified to teach. I was teaching English in 2 different places that I'm going to tell you about, and one is Lebanon, let's see, up here in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and the other was Myanmar, over here, formerly called Burma. So, this first place, this was a group of us connected to a church in town here. And we had gotten involved raising money for girls' scholarships. And we funded 6 Burmese girls to go to high school to pass their all-important junior high school test and then go on to the university. And so from there we sent, a group of us, 16 of us, went to 4 different monasteries to teach English. So, most of them had no special training. And I have to mention right away that this was not a paid job. So this might not be of interest to you, except that our airfare and our board while we were there was paid for. We were staying in the monasteries. And here you can see that we were with the Buddhist monks in this Palancone monastery out in the middle of the countryside. And the country is 86% Buddhist. And what I learned just in teaching in these 2 different places, Myanmar and Lebanon, is that the cultural context is everything. It's all important, knowing the background of the country and the people. So, for example, in Myanmar, they have had a repressive dictatorial government since 1962, which has made a 2-tier society. So the military up here has all the fancy schools and hospitals and care that they need. So by default, the monks in the monasteries had to become the sort of default educators of everybody who wasn't at the top here connected to the military. So they had no real training in education. It's a highly respected institution, but they were doing the best they could. And so we went and we taught young teachers to improve their English. And because the government had been so bad, education was badly neglected. And as Dori mentioned, there was this traditional learning system where The teacher is the big authority. He writes something on the board, everybody just memorizes it, repeats it, and that's it. And what's interesting in Myanmar, as I said, it's predominantly Buddhist, and so their religious beliefs have a big influence on this worship of authority, because they think that people have multiple lives. And so if they're an authority figure, like a teacher, they are so because they were really virtuous and good in their previous lives, and so they got to be an authority person. So the tendency is just to venerate the people, and the idea of education is simply memorize what the authority tells you without really understanding the meaning, without really having discussion, without any critical thinking. So their English, you know, they were wonderful people. They could, you know, if I wrote something in English on the board, they could understand a little, but they could not understand my speech. They had never been around English-speaking people. They couldn't understand me, and they couldn't make any sentence that I could understand. So we only worked with them for a few weeks, and we're going back next year. And this is, we certainly don't have to be involved in my church to do this. We had outsiders doing it. And so if you were interested, you could go and be part of it. What we found out was that, you know, there was no mention ever that we were, you know, coming from a Christian church. We were in a Buddhist country, and they were rather xenophobic about foreigners because of the colonial past, where the British had come in, had run everything in their country, had brought in Indians, brought in Chinese. The Burmese pretty much had no role in their country. After having a proud history, they were suddenly nobody from about mid-19th century until the end of World War II. And, you know, like a lot of places, the British were arrogant. They wouldn't take off their shoes in the holy pagodas and so on. So you had this mindset that, you know, they didn't want foreigners in. So as Christian, from a Christian group, we did not ever say a word. And it's really progress, I think, that, you know, we could go there, help them as they needed help, and show them that we really cared about their getting out of the dark ages of this military government, and make progress. We really connected with them somehow, even without much of the common language, and showed them that we really cared about their country and about them. And what we found out is that really made it possible for the abbots and the Buddhist leaders that were running these monasteries to start thinking in terms of a different way of education. They could feel that we cared about them, and so it became, you know, something they thought about, that here's how these people do things. They talk about things, they discuss things. It's not just memorizing what the teacher says, and it's a different approach. Okay, but we loved the place. We're going back. Some people have already gone back. Okay, skipping. Our time is running out. Here in Lebanon, you have a very different cultural situation because of the historical past. And if you can remember back to the map with the Eastern Mediterranean, Lebanon was always a trading center. The Chinese road and all the trade routes from the Far East came to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Lebanese cities. It used to be Phoenicia. We talk about phonetics, and that's because the Phoenicians were the first to devise a phonetic alphabet, because they had to have this for trading. So anyway, cosmopolitan, valuing education, speaking 5 languages. I could never practice my Arabic because as soon as, they knew I was a Western person, as soon as I open my mouth, they start speaking English. And so they were very sophisticated that way about historical differences. I was teaching, sophisticated also about valuing education. So I was in an Armenian college, and the Armenians they were close to the Caucasus that Dori pointed out, and they had become part of Turkish society, and then there was this terrible genocide in 1914, 1915. Millions of Armenians were murdered, lots of them were forced out, but amazingly, about 85 years after that genocide, they were established, 250,000 of them in Lebanon, and they had this university, Haigazian, where I was, and also several private high schools. So this was a very different society to teach English in. And along with this, they were used to different groups, but yet there were these deep, ancient religious communities that went back 1,000 years. All various kinds of Christians, various kinds of Muslims. And I once had my students, I said, what's the first thing you notice about somebody that comes into our classroom? Thinking they would say, well, man or woman. Or the very first thing was whether they were Druze, whether they were Shia, whether they were Sunni, whether they were Orthodox. The religious community immediately registers. So anyway, in this situation, what I found as a literature teacher and a writing teacher was that it provided a sort of neutral place when you had a short story or a play or a poem. It provided a place to be able to talk about important stuff, important life stuff, where you didn't have to, you could sort of shed your religious affiliation and just talk about things. And it was a way to bring these very disparate groups together. So anyway, here I was sponsored by a faith-based outfit. This was the global arm of the UCC and Disciples churches. And I was able to get this job because I was involved in a UCC church. So if you are involved in a church, most of the churches have, what used to be missionary work, but it's very different nowadays. They don't, I never, as a mission worker, I never had to say a word about religion. I mean, it's really shifted. You're not converting anybody. You're just doing a job, and the country tells the church, we have these jobs that we want filled. And, I applied because I was having trouble getting a job down in Florida, where I went to help my parents be old. And so I could do, this is what I always had done as a lit teacher, and so, there I was for 3 years teaching in this Armenian university. So again, just like in Myanmar, I could be connected to a faith-based community, but never really having to convert or do anything but my job. So that was good. Okay, moving on quickly, and you can see in a slide like this, the emotional solidarity among the young men, very close to each other. And what I found, and this was another thing, I was speaking on the topic of education, I was getting educated about who I was compared to, just being in this country, you never have to think about things. When you're confronted with another culture, suddenly, hey, I don't, and what I was getting at in this classroom situation with these wonderful kids was that that they you know, their idea was, okay, you know, you help your friend succeed. So, like one time I said that, okay, they, you know, they could bring their notes to class for the test because it was an essay test. They could, you know, I wanted them to be able to, we were taking notes, they could use them. So finally, you know, I noticed, I look around, everybody's notes looked exactly alike. And what they had done is taken the girls' notes who took the best notes and made copies for everybody. And then another situation, you know, someone was talking, helping his friend, and you know, and I was, no, I do your own work, and they were just crushed that they couldn't help the guy succeed because this is his friend, and I was left, you know, alone afterward thinking, you know, why do we have to kind of go it alone? Why can't we help each other succeed? So that was one thing that I learned about myself, and another even more sort of subtle about kind of your own buried architecture, as it was, is that how important the time agenda was for me. I sort of programmed to make time count. And the way I learned that was just going to shop for groceries and, you know, looking very different from the people. You know, people in the shops would want to talk to me about their relative in Michigan that was doing this or that, and you know, the guy that sold chickens wanted to talk about something else, and so you know, it was hard for me to just, you know, sit and shoot the breeze as long as they wanted to do that. They would, you know, they would go on, and I just had this idea, I've got to get back to my office. And so I said, well, I need 2 chickens. And, you know, and I just saw this man's face fall because I had kind of brought it to the, you know, do your job level rather than the just human level. So, you know, this happened repeatedly. And I realized that when back in my office, why did you have to just rush back here? You know, to do what? You know, more important to really have a human encounter with this person and talk about their country and talk about this and that. And so I made a real effort to do that. And I just realized how programmed I was as an American. You know, somehow I had to make time count. And I had to be productive all the time. So they were very different. It was like the most important part of the day was just, you know, you happen to run into this person, total stranger maybe, in the shop, and you talk politics for 45 minutes or an hour, and if their customers come in, well, fine. They just took care of them. Okay, so moving on to this other topic. So,
For literally just a couple minutes.
okay, we'll go as quickly as possible. How does this relate to international education? Well, advocacy is a very important thing. It is creating political will by educating decision makers and building public support. So here's this group that I'm involved with, and Dori as well, and Jane as well, called Results. And what it does is it is a bipartisan citizen lobbying group. It influences political decisions to end poverty by creating advocates. And so volunteers like myself get trained to talk to people. They find out about how Congress works. They find out about how the appropriations process works. They find out about various poverty issues, what bills, what foreign aid now works, what kinds of programs work and what didn't. They're taught how to speak, how to write letters to the editor, how to write op-eds, how to talk to elected officials and the public. Okay, so here we are. You can see how bipartisan we are with both Tester and Danes at our international conference, which happens every year in Washington. People think, what's the use? you know, me talking to an official, me writing a letter, what good is that? But if you look at this study, if your member senator has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies have, according to the, directed to the Washington office? So the very top one, an in-person visit from a constituent, a contact from a constituent who represents other constituents, individual letters, individualized email messages, phone calls. Way down here, you have paid lobbyists and so on. So the upshot is it really does matter. Okay, so what do we advocate for? Various health, education, economic issues for global poverty, U.S. poverty, things like supporting SNAP, supporting Head Start, supporting earned income tax credits. How do we advocate? Well, we ask the legislators to fund, to give more robust funding each year for things like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, or to provide more funds for education. Here, Global Partnership for Education. You can see how over the years, 2013, 20 million, up to 125 million, 767 to 925. Okay, so that's one thing we do. And we get legislators to sign on to appropriations amounts. And you see how, the numbers have increased. The red there are the Republicans, the blue, the Democrats. No comment, but a greater and greater number. Okay, what gives hope and the desire to do this work is that you really see results. You really see how global poverty has gone down across the world. People living in extreme poverty, it's gone down because of not just our group's efforts, but other groups as well. In 1999, 106 million children didn't have access to primary education. This year, 61 million. Only 61 million didn't have access. But much remains to be done. There's all these children still out of school, and so on. 250 million can't read a single sentence. Girls don't get to school. Crises, refugees, and specific legislation. Okay, here's one that we worked hard to pass to strengthen accountability. And it, in fact, passed this year in the House on September 7th. So we're out of time.
So I was just going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, do you have a way that we could contact you or get a hold of this organization that does this advocacy?
Yeah, I have these things that if the students are interested, they can, here's stuff on results, you can come and get it. Here are the two websites for the religious organizations that I was connected to. And most important, and I'll close with this since we're run out of time, is this thing that all of you could qualify for. And it's really a great opportunity. They give scholarships to people your age for a year-long program to learn about advocacy and pay your way to this international conference that happens every year in the summer. So have a look and consider applying, because I can pretty well promise you that if you did apply, you would be accepted. So it's a great way to learn about Congress, about how the legislature works, about how the appropriations process works, and to hear a lot of marvelous speakers at this conference. So, sorry to
take a minute and say thank you to our two speakers. We've got things to think about in the Montana-Missoula front and the U.S. front, but also things globally. So a lot of great ideas if we could give them a round of applause. And we will be back again for another talk next week, Wednesday night at 7 o'clock.